So then, since it is a shadow of itself, what does this mean for the trajectory of the war? Is this the beginning of the war? Is the war essentially over? Will we see the hostages be released? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a lot of noise right now in Israel. There are those who are celebrating, and then there's the hostage families who are saying that's great, but we're not celebrating. We still want the hostages released. The reports that I've seen out of the Arab world today suggest that Hamas has not reached a more flexible negotiating position as it relates to the hostages. There are those that even fear that perhaps they'll be killed because Sinwar was killed and there's really no more fighting left to be done to protect them. That's a possible option or an outcome that we could be looking at. And that would, of course, be terrible news for the Israelis and those families in particular. But I don't know if we have a clear sense of what the trajectory of the war looks like. I mean, Hamas looks defeated, but they may continue to fight. There will always be young men in tracksuits willing to pick up AK-47s and fight in the name of Palestinian nationalism or Islamism or a combination of the two. I think we're likely to see low-level insurgency continue in the Gaza Strip for some weeks, maybe even some months. But I do think that we finally reached a moment where we can start to think about the post-war reconstruction effort, which has been something that I think folks have been reluctant in the region to engage in, that it felt too soon. I don't think it's too soon any longer. That's the good news. Again, the bad news is that this is not a war that is limited to Gaza. We are seeing that 6 other fronts are still hot. The Israelis will continue to fight those. Those are all Iran-backed actors or Iran itself still waging this war. And so even if Gaza goes quiet, there's very likely a good bit of fighting left to be done in the Middle East.
And to your point about a post-war Gaza, Israel's foreign minister did touch on this in a statement that he released. Quote, "The elimination of Sinwar opens the possibility for the immediate release of the hostages and paves the way for a change that will lead to a new reality in Gaza, without Hamas and without Iranian control." So let's talk about that potential new reality in Gaza. Do you think that's likely? What's the likelihood of that without Hamas and without Iranian control?
Well, when you have Hamas, you have Iranian control, right? Hamas is an Iranian proxy at the end of the day. But I think it's important to note, though, that Hamas is not the only Iran-backed group in Gaza. There is Islamic Jihad, and there's also a group called the Popular Resistance Committees. Actually, you could even say that the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, another small group, they have Iran support as well. I think we're watching the end of Iran's ability to bring in weapons, fighters, cash into the Gaza Strip. The Israelis have the borders sealed up, and they are really, I think, changing the equation by taking out the top leaders. 23 out of 24 fighting brigades of Hamas have been destroyed. Israel has done its work over there. So then that raises the question of what happens next. What the Israelis want is they want international donors, probably led by the UAE, maybe Saudi Arabia, certainly the United States, the Europeans, to come in and help rebuild. The Israelis are not likely to relinquish security in the Gaza Strip. They'll probably keep the army there in order to fight those pockets of resistance, that low-level insurgency. I think that's quite likely. But then comes the really interesting part, which is, what do you do with Gaza? How do you rebuild it? Do you make it look like it used to look before, which is to say a very crowded place with limited resources, or do you try to turn this place into Singapore and really try to show the Arab world that this is what happens when you purge an area of Iranian control, when you relinquish these very violent aims of a group like Hamas that, again, blended Palestinian nationalism, a vitriolic sort of brand of Palestinian nationalism with Islamism, a deeply violent and religiously imbued ideology. If you can rid the region of Iran and these sort of factors, right, the nationalist factor and the Islamist factor, that's when I think you can begin to think about a Gaza that looks a lot different than anything we've ever seen. You can rebuild it in a way that would be sustainable, that it would live side by side with Israel. Now, the question is, how many in the Arab world are going to buy into this? And literally, who's going to pay for it? These are the questions that I think finally we're beginning to ask. My sense, by the way, is that after the election in November here, then you're going to start to see these actors come out of the woodwork in the Arab world saying, we're willing to work with you, but we want to know who we're working with first before we start making commitments, because they're going to be asking for things in return from the United States, whether it's defense guarantees, whether it's weapon systems, whatever it is, there's going to be some negotiation. We're at the souk, we're at the market. They're going to be a little haggling right now. That's not a bad thing, because I think we need to make sure that our allies trust us as we head into hopefully a new era in the Middle East.